Welcome back, class. In this next short section, we're just going to be looking at body cavities, right? What do we mean by body cavities? You can see here within the body, it looks like we have a thoracic cavity and an abdominal pelvic cavity that are going to be storing or housing different organs. Okay, so think of it that way. So these body cavities are going to protect our organs from accidental shocks. And these cavities also permit changes in size and shape for the internal organs because many organs do change in size and shape. A stomach can get bigger, a uterus can get bigger, right? If there's a baby inside. So one of the things that I want you to see is that the upper cavities and the lower cavities are going to be divided by the diaphragm. And if we look here, this thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity or abdominal pelvic cavity, they are divided from each other by this muscle here called the diaphragm. Okay. Also pay attention to anterior and posterior. Okay, so in the anterior portion is where we're going to have the thoracic cavity and abdominal pelvic cavity. I also want you to know that in the thoracic cavity, we have the pleural cavity and the pericardial. Pleural refers to the lungs, and pericardial refers to the heart. And then in the abdominal pelvic cavity, in this abdominal region, you're going to hear the term peritoneal. Peritoneal is going to refer to your digestive organs and the digestive tract. On the dorsal side or the posterior side, we're going to have the cranium, like the cranial cavity, and then we'll have the vertebral cavity back here, right? So the cranial cavity is going to be for like the brain, and the ventral cavity, a vertebral cavity for the spinal column. You're going to have the meninges here, cerebral spinal fluid here. All right, so there's a difference between anterior and posterior portions. So this right here is going to be our cranial cavity. This will be our vertebral cavity. This will be our thoracic cavity, or pleural cavity for the lungs. This will be our diaphragm, and then this will be our abdominal cavity, and then down here at the bottom would be the pelvic cavity. So the dorsal cavity, which was everything back here, right, dorsal or posterior, that's going to have the cranial cavity for the skull, the vertebral canal, which is going to house the spinal cord, and around the brain and the spinal cord are the meninges. Okay. In the ventral cavity, so now we're looking at everything that we're going to have in this section here in the front. That's going to be the abdominal cavity, the diaphragm, your lungs, your heart, and the mediastinum. Okay, the mediastinum is just the region in which the main vessels that lead into the heart and lungs, that's called the mediastinum. So now that we have those cavities down, I want you to, we're going to be talking about two main layers. One is called a visceral layer, and the other is called a parietal layer. If you look at this person's fist on the right-hand side, going into this balloon, right? When it pushed into a balloon, it kind of creates two layers. It creates the one that comes into direct contact with the fist, and if this was the heart, this would be called the visceral pericardium. Peri means around, cardium is heart. So the visceral layer is the layer that comes into contact with the organ itself. So if it's the heart, it's the visceral pericardium. If it's the lung, it's called the visceral pleura. If it is the digestive organs, it's the visceral peritoneum, right? So visceral means it's coming into contact with the actual organ. But on this side here, this is another layer. This layer, which is on the outside, does not come into direct contact with the organ. That's called the parietal layer. Or if it's the heart, it's the parietal pericardium. If it's the lungs, it's the parietal pleura. If it's the digestive organs, it's the parietal peritoneum. So parietal means it's lining the body wall. The visceral layer is going to cover the organ. Okay. So now in this picture, we're looking at the lungs. And remember, lungs are interchangeable with pleura. Pleura. When we talk about heart, it's pericardium. When it's digestive tract, peritoneum. So those are the three words to be familiar with: pericardium, pleura, and peritoneum. So let's look at the heart first. Let me just change the color. Let's make this bluish. So here in the heart, let's look at this layer right here on the inside. When it's on the inside, it's touching the actual organ or the viscera. So that's called, since it's the heart, that's the visceral pericardium. Remember, when you put the fist in the balloon, it then creates an outer portion that does not touch the viscera. That outer portion is the parietal pericardium. And in between the visceral and the parietal pericardium, there's the cavity called the parietal cavity. And this is where the pericardial cavity. And in the pericardial cavity is going to be pericardial fluid. Same exact concept. Let's look at the lungs. Lungs are always pleura. So if we follow the part here that's touching the lungs itself on the inside portion, that part is the visceral pleura. When we look at the part on the outside lining the wall, that's the parietal pleura. In between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura is the pleural cavity that will have pleural fluid. All right, so let's say if this showed up in the past, so now we're looking at the heart. We see that there's one line there. It's not pointing to this one here. So the one closest to the heart or to the organ is the visceral pericardium. Parietal pericardium would be that one there, right there. All right, now let's look at the last slide here. We're still see the words parietal and visceral, but now we're looking at peritoneum. The peritoneum is going to refer to everything here, right? You got the liver, we have the stomach, we have the intestines. There's, all of these are going to be surrounded by the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. But here, since this is lining the entire wall, going all the way around, if you look at that blue, the entire wall, with the exception of what looks like the pancreas and the kidneys, those are retroperitoneal, meaning behind the peritoneum. So this is lining the wall, that's the parietal peritoneum. If it was the visceral would be like this. That would be the visceral. What surrounds that whole wall, That's the parietal peritoneum. Okay. All right, let's see if anyone has any questions for me.